Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our June meeting. We'll go ahead and call the Land Use and Housing Committee to order. I'll go ahead and read our required opening statement as permitted by the Governor's Disaster Declaration of January 8, 2021. Determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee to meet in person. To ensure as transparent and open meeting as possible, we've posted the meeting materials approximately 1 week in advance. We'll be providing a recording of this meeting linked on the website. We will take all votes by roll call. And just to be clear, rather than doing a roll call for attendance right now, we're going to go ahead and wait and take attendance simultaneously when we take our roll call vote for the approval of the minutes in agenda item 3.0. So again, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get down to business. We'll go ahead and look at agenda changes and announcements. Matt, are there any updates or changes?
No major changes to the agenda this morning. We do have a couple of things that we will mention in other business near the end of the meeting. Excited to show you guys a brief video that CMAP recently released about zoning, and also briefly discuss that survey that we sent out to all the members of this committee a few weeks ago. But we'll get to that a little bit later on. That's it.
All right, thanks, Matt. So we'll go ahead and move on to our roll call and our approval of minutes. So the minutes from the April 6th meeting were already distributed. Everyone should have had a chance to look over those. For any changes or additions, now's the time to bring them up. If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
Motion to approve. This is Bob Tucker.
Thanks, Bob. Do we have a second?
Second, Christy Noble.
Thanks, Christy. All right, so Dominic, can you go ahead and do our roll call, please?
Hi, yes, and as Chair noted, we will be doing two things simultaneously. If you present, attendance, roll call, and then a yes, no on approval of the minutes. So if you could do that when your name is called, I do appreciate it. And I apologize for any coughing I may do as I'm recovering from a cold. Matt Osselmeyer. Drew Awesome. Alan Banks. Christy Noble.
Here and yes.
Thank you. Angela Brooks.
Here and yes.
Susan Campbell. Lisa DiChiara.
I just admitted Lisa about 5 seconds ago. Give her a moment. I imagine she may be able to be here. We can circle back around
Lisa.
also.
Okay, I'll circle back around. Mackenzie Droz.
Here, and I have to abstain because I was not at the last meeting.
Okay. David Dubois.
Present and yes.
Benjamin Fenton. Nancy Furfer is absent with notice. Veronica Gonzalez.
Here and yes.
Paul Haas. Christine Cobb.
Here, good morning.
And is that a yes or no or abstain for the minutes?
Sorry, yes.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Steve Manella.
Good morning. This is Tony Mattingly. I'm sitting in for Stephen Manoa today, and so I'll abstain from that vote.
Okay, thank you. Heather Mullins.
Present and yes.
Arnold Randall. Caitlin Ritter.
Here and yes.
Dennis Sandquist. Kyle Smith.
Present and yes.
Robert Tucker.
I'm here and yes.
Mark Van Kerhoff. Eric Wagner.
This is Krista Brown. I'm here on Eric's behalf, and yes on the minutes.
Okay, great. And Miriam Zuck. And Lisa, you were being admitted when we were first doing it. We're just taking the roll call and the minutes.
Okay, thank you. This is Lisa D. Kira. I'm here, present.
Okay. And is that yes on the minutes?
Pardon me?
And for the minutes, were the yes, no, or
Oh,
abstain?
yes, thank you.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
And we've also got Drew has jumped on here.
Yep, Drew, awesome, present.
And as for the minutes, would that be a yes, no, or an abstaining?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, all.
Is there anyone else we didn't mention or anyone filling in for a committee member that hasn't announced themselves yet? Awesome, thanks.
All right, thank you, everyone. We'll move on to the next agenda item 4 for our CMAT board meeting update. Aaron Alaman, our CEO, is here to present this month's updates. So Aaron, take it away.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you on this lovely Tuesday, although I wish that it was sunny like this yesterday, but that's okay. You know, we have our board meetings upcoming next month, and we've been board and the MPO policy committee meets. They'll be talking more about the Onto 2050 update process and how we're laying that out. We've got to do an update to the 2050 plan that's due in October of 2022. But you know, there will be more to come on that. We're mostly planning on doing a technical update to the plan and not sort of a full update. So many of you may have experienced a full-on 2050 update where we were bringing strategy papers monthly to the committees for guidance and feedback and input. This planning process will really focus on sort of the core things that we need to update as opposed to going through sort of a whole new planning process. So you might not see as much of it. And that's intentional because we really want to make sure that we continue to advance the work that we have ongoing to implement the existing plan that we have. So we don't anticipate any major focus area changes. It's really about taking the new data that we have and looking at the financial plan. So let's see, I love this opportunity to hear a little bit more from you and the committees in terms of what you're interested in and thinking about. Also wanted to note too, and I think she's on the line here, we have a new director of strategic alignment, innovation, and engagement. Her name's Allison Case. She comes to us from USAID, International Development Organization. So I'm excited to have her here. Sorry to put you on the spot. I see her coming online to wave and say hello. You know, I think one of her roles coming on board here is to really help us think through how we make sure that we are getting the best value, both for you in contributing to our work that we have, and you know how we make sure that our committees are better connected to our board and to our work, and that we're really leveraging the expertise that we have in the room. I'll say that this committee has done some amazing things over the past year, and just hearkening back to your last meeting that you had, you know, really sort of taking a project that we have, helping us sort of problem solve, think about the strategies for advancing some housing work that we have and doing some small breakout group work, you know, is really innovative. And I think that's what we want to do with our committees, is making sure that we're not just, you know, talking at you, but that we're engaging you, leveraging your expertise and understanding how to bring that value to our work. So you'll see more of Allison coming And I know that many of us are eager to get back into person. So I wanted to just give you a little update if I haven't already and where we're thinking about that. And maybe I'll take a pause too and take some temperature in terms of where you all are in this as well. So, we've started to voluntarily allow staff back into the office on Wednesdays and Thursdays. Following CDC guidelines, the building does continue to have a mask mandate. We still continue to have staff or require staff to wear masks in the office. And then we plan on having this 2-day-a-week option available for staff throughout the summer, but have a target date of September 7th, where we would be bringing staff in for a maximum of about 10 days per month. So in a perfect world, if nobody had childcare or after school activities or, personal activities that they needed to get to, we would do something like having an A team and a B team, and they'd work Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday, and then have off the next Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday. And that's sort of what a lot of industries are doing. It gives, our employees a week sort of surrounding a weekend where they're working remotely and can have that flexibility. So we're anticipating to have some sort of schedule like that in place, recognizing that it might not work perfect for everybody. But and then with that, I think we're expecting that in the fall, we will probably begin to transition to some more in-person meetings. Our most important meeting that we would start off with in person would be our board meeting and our MPO policy committee meetings. So we anticipate having a fall meeting of the board in our offices, but our priority continues to be making sure that everybody's safe, to continue to watch the vaccination rates in the city, in the county, across the region. So, as we start to think about committee meetings, we haven't made a commitment in terms of when they will be back in the office, but I will take a pause here and just ask for some feedback from committee members in terms of, your level of comfort or interest, or has this format been valuable in terms of, I know we have so many people coming from across the region that there is some time savings, but there is also a lot of value to being face-to-face.
Are there folks who want to comment on that or ask any questions about the reopening plan? Dominic and Matt, can you help me keep an eye out? I can't see everyone from where I'm at. Thanks.
Bob?
I'll just start the ball rolling. I think we all have recognized now the extreme convenience of something like this, but I do miss seeing all of you in person. I'd be very comfortable soon attending in person and gathering and or having the joint option, which I know a lot of people are trying to build up the technology to do that. And I don't know what CMAP's doing in that realm. Sort of these, people are calling them what, their Zoom rooms now, where maybe half the attendance is in person and half is via Zoom. But yeah, no, I would love to see people in person.
Thank you. Well, if you have thoughts and if others have thoughts, please feel free to share them with Dominic and with Matt or with Adam. We'd be happy to hear a little bit more. I think one of the challenges too is just making sure that there's that the meeting agenda fits I guess the way people are attending, right? So in Zoom, right, you have to design the meetings a certain way, and in person, we would want to make sure that everyone was able to contribute to. So we'll continue to ideate around what makes the most sense, and reach out to you and hear from you all in our committees as well to get a better understanding of what folks' comfort level is and what we think makes sense. So thank you. I just wanted to touch on two other things really quickly here, is that at the beginning of last summer, the CMAP board collectively put out a statement reconfirming our commitment as an agency and as a board to equity. And one of the ways we wanted to illustrate that commitment is to really make sure that we have an inclusive process for incorporating stakeholder feedback into our plans, our programs, the transportation dollars that we allocate across the region. And so we are beginning to develop a pilot program to address the challenges of engaging community stakeholders, or challenges sounds bad, I should say the opportunities, I think, to do better in terms of engaging low-income households across the region, limited English speakers across the region, minority populations across the region, something that 2050 really prioritizes here. And so you'll hear a little bit more about the elevated program here too, but we're working with the Center for Neighborhood Technology and a couple others to help us design a program that helps us get at getting better feedback. And it's not just about the feedback, it's then how do you use that to help shape the region's plans, or how do you use that to help shape the way we program transportation dollars across the region? And are there things that we need to be doing better in order to have more thoughtful or better engagement at the community level too? Oftentimes we're talking about technical things, right? And so it's hard, how do we break the information down appropriately, and how do we make sure that people have sort of the chance to be able to contribute in meaningful ways to our work as well? So we imagine that this work will be ongoing for the next couple of years here too. And so you'll hear more about that in the months to come here. But it's an exciting opportunity, I think, for us to really sort of get things right and think about too, not just Chicago or Cook County, but also begin to think about Lake County and Will County and Kane and Kendall counties as well, because we've identified places that haven't had equal access to opportunity and equal investment across our region. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about all of those communities as we're moving forward here. And then the last note I wanted to touch on was that we are going to have a State of the Region and Regional Excellence Awards program. We're planning for October 7th. So if you would save the date, it will be a breakfast meeting. The goal will be to talk about our progress in advancing the 2050 plan, to celebrate some successes from stakeholders across the region. And so one of the ways we'll celebrate successes is by having our first ever regional awards program. It was in last week's weekly update. So if you have ideas or thoughts on people we should be reaching out to, encouraging, sending notes to apply, or if you have ideas of people who you would like to see in those categories, please do let us know. We'll be happy to do some follow-up work on that. The other thing that's going on related to that is we're doing our first ever public opinion poll as well. And so I really want to make sure that we understand where communities and residents are across our region on some of the things that we want to talk about, right? Whether it's how do we better utilize our infrastructure? As we think about the declining revenues from the motor fuel taxes, lots of places are talking about vehicle miles traveled fees, right? And so what's the opportunity for us to begin to advance some of these bigger policy conversations across the region? So we hope to have some good feedback from the public opinion poll to be able to make sure that we're aligning our work with opportunity areas that there are in terms of where the public's understanding is in terms related to some of the 2050 implementation areas that we're focused on here. So those are my updates. I'm happy to take any questions or hear from you in terms of any thoughts related to anything that I touched on.
Thanks, Erin. Are there any quick comments or questions for Erin while we have her here?
Well, thank you. It's good to see you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Erin, for joining us and for that report. All right, let's go ahead and move on then to our next agenda item 5. We're going to talk about best practices for local incentive use. This is actually tabled from the November 2020 meeting. So we're going to go ahead and have a presentation and some discussion around CMAP's handbook for best practices for incentive reform for taxing in the region. So we're going to go ahead and turn things over to Matt and Austin and Dustin and whoever else is here to present. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. All right, can folks see my screen? Is that working?
You're good, you're good.
Great. All right, so yeah, thanks, Adam. This was on our agenda a number of months ago. We got into some good discussion on some other topics that month, so we made the game time decision to hold off this presentation for a few more months until it made more sense to fit in. So I'm excited to bring it back to this group today. The delay actually allowed us to expand this presentation a little bit. The original idea had been to bring back the incentives guide development to this committee. We talked about the guide development very early in that process last March, actually at our last in-person meeting. And I wanted to circle back around and let you guys know that with your input, the input of a number of other working committees, that portion of the project was finished. And in the interim, we've actually launched and moved ahead with a couple of other related projects. And so I'm here with my colleagues, Austin Edwards and Dustin Cagliari. who will talk about some of the work that is ongoing in the space as well. So I'm not going to dwell on the context too much here because we did talk about this about a year ago. Our work on local development incentives comes directly out of Onto 2050, which called for incentive reform, including stronger standards for incentive transparency and accountability, as well as better alignment of incentive use with local and regional goals, outcomes, and trade-offs. Onto 2050 specifically tasked CMAP with providing best practices and models to help local governments refine and improve their incentive use. And that's exactly what we sought to do with the local incentives guide and are continuing to do with some of our other work on this project. So just to situate you a little bit to the workflow here, we spent the last year and a half or so developing the incentives guide, which will be the first thing that I'll touch briefly on today. And then we'll focus in turn on a report on the prevalence of economic development incentives, which we are currently developing, as well as a consortium, a group of many local communities around the region that we're sort of just beginning to scope and put together to have conversations and move the region forward on incentive practices in general. And so the second and third items are in progress and so are worthy of more discussion. I'll only be talking briefly about the guide today, but I'm absolutely happy to answer any questions or hear comments as they come up. So feel free to interrupt me or drop something in the chat at any point here. So this is the incentives guide portion of the presentation. We were able to release this last September and have been bringing it around as much as possible as we can to various groups in the region. Although that has certainly been more complicated because so few meetings are happening in person as of yet. This work was based on committee engagement, a lot of stakeholder engagement as well as review of the academic research on the subject, of which there's plenty. And as we developed the research, we really identified what we think is one of, if not the central tensions behind local incentive use. And that's that the perspective on incentives looks very different, whether you're looking at it from the perspective of an individual taxing district or sort of a larger regional or longer term perspective. From the perspective of a municipality or any other taxing district, local incentive use is an incredibly rational tool. Communities face stiff competition from neighbors, revenue disbursement formulas reward competition, especially over sales tax generating businesses. And particularly in disinvested communities that struggle with slow growth, high property tax burdens, and limited staff capacity, incentive use is often seen as one of the only or the only sort of in reach economic development and community development tools that communities have available to them. On the other hand, when you look at more of a wider angle perspective, regionally or a longer term time horizon, things get a little bit more complicated. You have a substantial body of academic research that suggests that the average incentive does not actually sway business location decisions. One of the reasons for this is information asymmetry. Businesses that are seeking incentives may have a slightly different perspective on their location choices than what they communicate to the community they're asking for an incentive from. Where incentives are successful, excuse me, one of the outcomes of decreased tax revenues can be that the indirect costs of a new development, for example, the wear and tear of truck traffic on locally maintained roads, can be greater, sometimes substantially greater than the tax revenues that the development brings in. And then we have this sort of complicated longer term time horizon outcome, which is that competition over time, even for local governments that consistently win developments via incentives, can drive revenues down for all taxing districts as incentives become increasingly commonplace and expected. So in other words, we have a series of structural challenges that encourage incentive use, while simultaneously ongoing incentive use can reinforce some of those very structural challenges over time. And so this was one of the challenges that we were really trying to get at through this work. We set out to identify recommendations. Those recommendations fit into 4 broad principles. Those principles are that incentive use should always be performance driven. Incentive use should be transparent wherever possible. This transparency helps local businesses better understand what programs are available to them, as well as helping constituents understand their taxing district's fiscal priorities. Wherever possible, incentives should pursue equity. This is a complicated and hard nut to crack, and I think both Austin and Dustin will talk a little bit about this a little bit later on in some of their work. And then finally, incentives wherever possible should pursue regional growth rather than solely providing for local fiscal gain for individual taxing districts. So within these 4 buckets, we identified 10 strategies, and under each strategy, a handful of concrete implementable best practices. And there are 60 best practices throughout the document in all. I'm just going to grab a few of them to mention today. We've got some of the strategies on the left side here on the numbered list, and then on the right side, a selection of some of the practices. We're talking about encouraging communities to adopt formal incentive policies, to collaborate with their community members, to identify exactly what priorities are, collaborate with neighbors as well, to attempt to sort of improve the sort of broader perspective on incentives that occur throughout subregions and the region as a whole. There are very concrete things in the guide, like making sure that maximum incentive amounts or incentive amounts per job created, benchmarks like this are used to evaluate incentives that are used to make sure that they're cost effective. Wherever possible, negotiating public goods and figuring out ways that municipalities can reduce risk for businesses rather than providing tax incentives. So sort of directly addressing the underlying challenge. And then things like funding tailored job training as an incentive rather than a tax incentive. And if there are other sort of direct employment producing, equity producing goals that can be achieved within an incentive package rather than seeking those things out secondarily. So that's just a brief smattering of what's in the guide. In just a minute or two here, I'll drop a link to the PDF itself. I hope next time we meet in person, we can distribute physical copies of the guide as well. And with that, I will wrap up. That's the URL. I'll put that in the chat in a few minutes, and I'll hand it over to Austin to talk about incentives prevalence and the work we have ongoing.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone. My name is Austin Edwards. It's good to see some of you again. I'm a senior policy analyst here at CMAP, where I work on all things related to the regional economy. And recently that has included working on some of our work around incentives. So sorry, my cat is trying to move through the screen. So as Matt was mentioning, incentives can be a tool for achieving any number of public goals. And like any tool, once in a while, you need to do inventory and make sure that it remains fit for purpose. And as we think about what we as CMAP can do, is really about providing analysis, as we did in the guide, convening partners to discuss reforms, as Dustin will allude to in the consortium. And in between those is providing data, either because we have the data on hand or because we can provide the legwork that gathers the data, cleans it, and makes it available to others. So that's what I want to try to talk through today. Next slide, please. Today, I'll be providing some initial findings on 3 common types of incentive tools: sales tax rebates, tax increment financing or TIFs, and Cook County property tax incentive classes. In the report, we will also be looking at property tax abatements in collar counties and business districts, but in the interest of time, we'll skip over those today. About 2/3 of the municipalities in our region are currently implementing at least one of these incentive programs. Altogether, incentives cost local governments hundreds of millions of dollars. Due to how they are reported, it's difficult to sum up incentives use into a single cost figure, but we know that the numbers are big, and evaluating the efficacy of those incentives and identifying ways to improve them is critical. So moving to the next slide, as we think of some of the objectives of this work, it's really about improving the uptake of the guide itself that Matt just outlined, as well as engaging officials about the larger reforms that we can put in place to reduce the need for incentives over the long term, and then how we can do that by providing systematic data and context. So really something that I've found has been missing from the conversation before is sort of what's really the scale and the scope of what we're talking about. And then, of course, we want to put incentives use in the context of broader strategies. There are many things that go into making a community a good place to live, work, and play. And so where are we over-relying on incentives? Where can we use other strategies or other investments to be more effective? Next slide, please. So to start off with sales tax rebates, municipalities and counties can share a portion of their sales tax revenue generated in a particular development back to the individual businesses. And that can be either for their local option sales tax or a portion of the state sales tax that is dispersed to local governments. We found 328 active agreements across 123 municipalities. This is down slightly from our previous analysis in 2015, when we found 359 active agreements among 132 local governments. Some rebates are simply a percent of any tax revenue collected, but local governments also use other provisions to help limit the potential cost of offering these subsidies. Agreements may define the number of years that it is in effect, a minimum sales threshold, or requirements for occupancy, certified release space before revenues are rebated. A more common one is actually setting the maximum amount that will be returned. We don't have complete information, but of the published maximums, we know that they could total $447 million over their lifespan, but it could also well exceed that figure for those that don't have maximums or maximums that we are unaware of. Sales tax rebates can obligate a significant amount of funds over time without caps. 10 communities have maximum rebates of more than $10 million. 36 others have agreements that will last for more than 20 years with no reported maximum. So it's really an open question as to how much these agreements are costing our communities. And how are we choosing to use this tool? About half of sales tax rebate agreements are related to retail categories, and more than a third are going to vehicle dealerships. In 2012, the General Assembly passed legislation requiring local governments to report their sales tax agreements to the Department of Revenue, but the resulting database is inconsistent and incomplete. It's very frustrating to sort of wade through that data. For example, we only have information like maximums or the particular revenue source, state sales tax, local sales tax. We only have that information for about half of agreements. So there's still a lot of open questions out there that we would love to get answered if we can. Next slide, please. Also going back to some of the things that Matt was alluding to, municipalities with few revenue options often use sales tax rebates to spur development that has more local fiscal benefit than meaningful economic effect. The state's current tax system contributes to this type of sales tax driven development. Sales tax revenue typically composes about 10 percentage points more of the total revenues for communities with active sales tax rebate agreements. So there is a pretty distinct difference in the kinds of communities that are using these types of tools. And we're still delving into what is really driving those factors, but there is a pretty clear and consistent pattern across the board. Next, please. So moving on to Cook County assessment classes. Cook County assesses commercial and industrial property at a higher rate than residential property, 25% for commercial industrial and 10% for residential. There's a little bit of nuance there, but broadly speaking. And this results in a higher tax burden on many businesses. Incentive classes reduce that assessment rate for the awarded commercial and industrial property owners for up to 12 years, although many are also renewable. 95 municipalities in the county and portions of unincorporated Cook County use incentive classes in 2019. Altogether, this adds up to about 9% of the estimated commercial and industrial market value in the county. On the ongoing popularity of this incentive, we think is a pretty clear indication that classification continues to impede economic development, constrains local revenue options, and creates barriers to reinvestment in Cook County. Just over half of the tax burden for commercial and industrial taxpayers is a function of the burden shift inherent to the classification system. So if you have been around CMAP for very long, I'm sure you have heard us sort of beating the drum for the gradual phasing out of Cook County's classification system, because that's really what's going to address these underlying inequities over the long term. Next slide, please. The distribution of these incentive classes is really driven by two main factors. First is the presence of significant industrial lands like those in communities around O'Hare or across the south suburbs, as well as the statutory restrictions on Class 8 revitalization incentives to enterprise zones or particular townships in Southern Cook. So it's really there. So far, we found that they are fairly well targeted to the types of development that are laid out in statute as their intended purpose. Industrial developments make up about 2/3 of the total market value in the incentive classes. So this really is a narrative of the shift in industrial properties in Cook County over the last 30 or 40 years. Communities with significant industrial lands like McCook, Bedford Park, or North Lake incentivize nearly all of their industrial properties. So there are 21 municipalities that have industrial property making up more than 5% of their total market value. Of those 21 municipalities, 16 have placed at least 90% in incentive classes. So that's a lot of numbers to throw at you, but it indicates that those areas where there's a high concentration of industrial lands are incentivizing most of it. Next slide, please. Y'all are probably more familiar with TIFs than many of our other audiences, but just as a quick recap, these are used to fund improvements in blighted areas or to conserve areas that may become blighted. They effectively freeze the property tax base of various taxing authorities and then use any excess tax collections to finance redevelopment projects. So if you think of that light blue wedge in the center of this chart, there's sort of a wager that municipalities place to exchange that light blue revenue wedge in the hope of expanded tax base over the long term. And that's sort of the gamble that communities choose to play. TIFs can divert revenues from a wide area to benefit specific developments that would otherwise go toward general services and infrastructure. And there's sort of a lot of thoughts in the region as to how successful this model is, and we would hope to provide some context to that through this data. Next slide, please. You won't be surprised, TIFs are very prevalent in the region. About 6% of the region's total property tax base is committed to raising TIF revenues. There are 181 municipalities, or about 2/3 of those in the region, have with an active TIF district, with annual total revenues surpassing $1.3 billion. So very large sums of money being raised on these areas. Next slide, please. Altogether, more than $14.3 billion has been collected over the last 18 years through TIFs, with annual totals more than tripling. That's all adjusted for inflation. I should note here that these totals do not include the red-purple modernization in the city of Chicago, which is kind of a different beast in terms of using value capture to pay for transit improvements. There's a sort of a mixture of effects that are contributing to this growth. 35 more communities have established districts, and those that already had districts in effect in 2002 have either formed new districts or extended others by adding additional parcels. Many of the properties in TIF districts have also appreciated in value, and some local governments may have raised property tax rates to cover costs. It's a little difficult in the state's available data to discern which of those effects are at play in any given district, but we know that TIF use has continued to expand over the last 20 years. Regional trends are driven in part by the city of Chicago, which now makes up around 2/3 of annual TIF extensions, including downtown districts in the Loop that have accounted for pretty substantial shares of regional TIF totals. However, revenues in suburban Cook or the collar counties have also increased by about 155% over the same time period. So while the chart is a little difficult to read, those in the gray bars have also grown pretty substantially in the last 20 years. Next slide, please. So now that we have sort of the baseline data pulled together for each incentive program, we want to look across the board and think about what's the overarching narratives that we want to provide through the data. In particular, how does the prevalence and distribution of incentives align to target priority areas laid out in On 2050? Just a very cursory look so far. On average, municipalities with active incentive agreements, so that would be the bottom line in this table, those municipalities have more people living in economically disconnected areas. They have lower median household incomes and a smaller potential tax base per capita when we think in terms of real property values and annual retail sales. Yet they are more heavily reliant on property taxes for operating capital funds. So there's some pretty clear patterns in terms of who's reliant on incentives in order to spur development. These differences reflect both the distinct barriers to market reinvestment in higher need communities and the policies intended to priorities or restrict incentive use. We really want to think about what some of the potential geographies would be that we should be targeting with our incentive tools and how well we are currently targeting those areas. And then we also want to lay out some messaging around the structural solutions like modernizing the tax system or targeted reinvestment that can reduce the need for incentives over the long term, like I was saying a minute ago. Those messages are well laid out in On to 2050, but we want to sort of bundle them together with the data so that this can be a really effective tool for engaging state legislators or county officials on how we might think about some of those reforms. I'm happy to take questions now, but I think Matt and Dustin also want us to shift into discussion. So I will hand it over to Dustin.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Austin. Hi, everyone. My name is Dustin Cagliari. I'm an associate planner within the planning division. I'm here to introduce the Incentives Consortium and have a discussion with you all around incentives use and our approach to the project. So first up, I'll just start with a brief introduction of what we call our capacity building consortiums, which is a new program within CMAP. The capacity building consortia leverage CMAP's role and expertise in convening stakeholders to generate knowledge, build capacity, and shape policy around issues across the region. This program is an outgrowth of the Embedded Staff Planner program, which had placed CMAP staff within local municipal governments to help build their planning capacity. Program is funded through the MacArthur Foundation. So right now there are 3 consortia. There's Public Space and Innovation, which is taking an ongoing look at innovative best practices in public space growing out of really the last year in particular. Local incentives, which we're here to talk about today. And then there'll be a consortia around state revenue as well. And the overarching goal of all the consortia is to leave behind capacity after activities in the participating communities. So capacity will be built through professional development, peer exchange, industry-focused conversations and presentations, and policy recommendations. Next slide. I'm just going to kind of run through this quick because I know we want to move to discussion. We're getting a little tight on time, but so at its core, the consortia are about 4 things: learning, collaborative decision-making, trust building, and capacity building. And so the Incentives Consortium will be a collaborative learning and decision-making process around this topic with a range of activities with the eventual goal of building trust and openness to collaboration, which we know on this topic can be sticky, as Matt has outlined. Next slide. So what's in it for both CMAP and the potential participating communities? The way we see it, these are the goals for those that are involved. So for CMAP, we're going to be leveraging our expertise in convening stakeholders, generating knowledge, building capacity, and shaping policy. On the community side, there's the professional development opportunities, there's connecting with peers and neighbors, there's learning and generating best practices together, and then there's those avenues to establish potential partnerships, both institutionally, through industries, or with each other. Next slide. So some key considerations as we've been thinking through this project. number one, making its incentives more effective. That's a recommendation on 2050. That's what we're all talking about here today. Whether people see eye to eye on their use, we all can agree that they can be more effective. Step two, we're thinking about, obviously, the way this presentation outlined, the incentives guide was step one. Prevalence report is kind of step two. And we're seeing the consortium almost as step three of this work. So through a collaborative process, we'll be developing ideas and capacity for the conversations around opportunities for improvement. And then finally, in order to get towards policy change, we need to build trust and consensus amongst stakeholders. And so throughout each of these activities, the capacity for incentives policy change amongst the participants will be enhanced. Next slide. So the program has been scoped out in phases, each of which has its own achievable goal to increase capacity around incentives work. We see this project likely running about 18 months from start to finish. So in our, we call it pre-work phases, we'll be convening a group of peer communities, that is communities who aren't direct neighbors or competitors, but are similar in terms of size, industries, or incentive uses. And that's something we want to talk about with all of you today. To have facilitated discussions and conversations with the development industry experts and each other through a peer learning process. In these phases, we'll kind of be testing out our logic of collaboration and refining our goals and approach for the full consortium. And then following the pre-work, we'll be moving into the sub-regional consortium phases. And so if you could advance it, Matt. In the full consortium, we'll be aiming to do the work within a sub-region. And so the project is in 5 phases, the first of which is identifying a sub-region within which to do this work, where this project can work best and where we can obtain agreement with local partners. The remaining 4 phases are professional development focused, within which we will seek to establish shared direction through discussions, listening sessions, and relevant examples and case studies. Industry exchange by leveraging industry partners and data analysis with an aim to generate a scoring rubric or something to help evaluate potential deals. Peer exchange, which will really help us accelerate action on policy through expert panels and potentially a memorandum of understanding within the consortium to continue to meet even when CMAP may no longer be involved. And finally, the ultimate end goal of this project is reaching consensus and achieving some concrete policy steps through sub-regional collaboration. And so with that, and I know there's been a lot thrown at you here this morning, I'm happy to take any questions on how we're developing the consortium, and I'm sure Matt and Austin are happy to take questions as well. But I've also prepared some discussion questions to get us thinking. And yeah, I'll take it from there. Matt, I don't know if you want to kind of facilitate this or how you wanted to approach that.
I wonder if we can start by just asking the committee if they have general feedback on any of these sort of the 3 legs of this stool as described over the last 20 minutes or so. And we can sort of move the conversation in any way that makes sense based on the committee's interest.
Yeah, and Matt, this is Adam. I just want to step in real quick. I want to have open discussion on this for a few minutes, but I know since we are behind a few minutes too, I want to make sure we leave room for the rest of our presentation. So it's not enough, but can we limit total discussion on this to about 5 minutes? Is that okay with everybody? Okay. All right. Cool. Go ahead. Sorry.
This is Christy Noble. I had a quick question. Has CMAP reached out to developers or people that are seeking land to set that expectation not to be looking for corporate subsidies to land in communities. They pit communities against each other. There's no verifiable way of us determining need for these subsidies. These are just asks. So how are we working with the actual developer side of the equation to lower that expectation that there's going to be buckets of money or incentives available at the local level?
Yeah, I'd say the primary role, I think that's an excellent question and point, Christy. I think the primary role that we've been operating from is one of working with municipalities and taxing districts in the region to help them think about their interactions with the private developer community and try to inform those conversations as best we can through CMAP's traditional role as being a support of policy and planning support for local governments in the region. Certainly be open to hearing input on the sorts of spaces that we might be able to enter to have the sorts of conversations you're talking about.
Yeah, and I'll just add, part of the consortium, the way we're thinking about it, is working with the Urban Land Institute at one of these stages to have those sorts of conversations, bringing in people in the development industry to talk about, particularly in their point of view, where there's opportunity, where there are items that maybe municipalities think they need to offer, but they really aren't weighing those decisions one way or the other. Yeah, I think there's going to be some opportunity for that through the consortium. So I'll just put that on.
Yeah, I was just thinking more of the state with the DECO. They're the ones that really partner with developers to help them locate in municipalities. I think that would be a good partnership.
Yeah, absolutely.
Susan, I see your hand. Go ahead and go next.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. Hi, everybody. So thank you all for looking at this as comprehensively as you are. I know that CMAP, this has been a topic of interest for CMAPs for quite some time. I was going to suggest, that possibly the report, or that the second report, look at the differences of incentives, because a lot of people, when they say incentives, they lump them all together, but there are very big differences between the types of incentives, for example, that DCEO offers to a company and a developer, which is really a recruitment tool, versus the property tax incentives used by many of the municipalities, particularly in the south suburbs, which is a retention tool, and really kind of a line of last defense because they have nothing else to offer before a company goes to Indiana. So I think, we can't just, lump them all together and say incentives are bad, you should be doing A, B, and C, when there are different types of incentives and they're used for different purposes. And since, everyone is going to be looking at things through an equity lens in particular, I liked the fact that you all were pointing out that a lot of the industrial incentives are used in the industrial areas to their advantages. But then the converse of that is that, well, what do the other areas have to offer to compete with that? So, I think it's important that you just keep that top of mind as you go through this body of work. And I know we've had these discussions before, but so that everyone can recognize that there are many communities that see this as their only thing they have to offer. And so if you're not going to offer this, then what can they do? It's important to say what they can do or what they do have available to offer to help them compete, as opposed to just saying they shouldn't use this. So our office, as you know, looks at special circumstance tax incentives, primarily vacant land that has been vacant for an unusual period of time, either too short or too long. And we review that body of work with the assessor's office. We will be actually looking at the classifications that we analyze and looking at ways to try to revamp that whole system in the next 2 years. So I'd like you to include Tricia Raffalo who's going to be tasked with that mighty project of looking at the entire ordinance and seeing how we can look for ways to improve it. So if she could be part of your committee, that would be great.
I think that's all great feedback. I mean, I did not delve into it today, but we do have some further breakdowns of looking at the individual incentive classes and what some of those trends are for Class 8, Class 6B, and thinking about how we might be able to sort of focus some of that work and get a little bit more detailed. I think one of the challenges really across the board is the quality of data that we have access to. So we aren't really able to evaluate incentives use because we don't have sort of data on outcomes or even for TIFs collected data on their expenditures. So there are some questions that we're going to have to leave open, but to point to where we need better information or better data and some of the practices that might help us think through some of those questions. And then ultimately, I think for the prevalence report in particular, we really want to direct it more towards those larger structural issues that are driving incentives use, so that hopefully over time communities are less reliant on them in order to spur development. But that is all.
As it
great.
relates
We
to
appreciate
the data,
the reference.
yeah. Go ahead.
I was just saying that we appreciate the reference, so we will try to.
Okay, sure. And I'll put her in touch with you guys. As it relates to the data, do you have enterprise zone data for the sales tax?
We don't for enterprise zones. We're really very focused on those local incentives in particular. We have another project, hopefully in the pipeline, if we can get green lighted, to also look at state incentives as well, but it's going to have to be a follow-on.
Yeah, because we're finding better use of that for retail than the local Class 7s.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I want to move on in a couple minutes to our next agenda item. I know there's a lot of discussion about this. Maybe I want to take one more. At least I saw your hand earlier, so I'll go to you in just a second. But maybe for folks who still want to ask questions or discuss this, can we get email contacts out to everybody for the staff that worked on this, or have we done that already?
I'll drop them in the chat in just a few minutes, but I think that's a great point. We're certainly happy to continue this conversation with any committee member outside of the meeting.
Okay, well, Lisa, let's go ahead and go to you, and then we can move on. Thanks.
Sure, and sorry, there's a garbage truck going by me if you hear background noise. Yeah, I was really hoping that we could see models in this study of, you know, both successful uses of each of the incentive types you're highlighting, as well as maybe non-successful examples. And I know you said you're having a hard time collecting that data. It may be that even members of this committee can give some potential examples of, you know, projects in their communities where, you know, the sales tax rebate worked well or didn't work well. The property tax incentive, the TIF did work well, didn't work well, you know, and your third. I'm wondering if it may be members of this committee can think of projects to highlight, because I really think a project, a study like this, that you need to have some pictures and some narrative of real projects that did work or didn't work with these incentives, so that one can really wrap their head around them and understand both the benefit and the buyer's remorse. I mean, both scenarios.
We do have a similar report that was put out, I think, in 2014 that took more of a case study approach and has some of that sort of nuance in it. We have not yet decided whether or not to include some elements of those that may be in sidebars that sort of help give a little bit more context and detail to the picture for those who aren't as familiar with them. But it's a good note. We'll consider it. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for that great discussion, and sorry I had to cut it short, but want to make sure we get to our last couple of presentations here. The conversation again can keep them going through email or direct contact with staff. So moving on to agenda item 6, we have another discussion. We're about 15 minutes behind schedule, so I'm going to ask hopefully Lindsay if you can fit this presentation and discussion to about 15-20 minutes total. I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay, who's going to talk about the Elevated Chicago Garfield Green Line Action Plan project that CMAP has been working with the RTA and others on. So Lindsay.
All right, thank you so much. I'll let Dominic get that up. Good morning, everybody. As mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the Equitable Transit-Oriented Development Action Plan for the Garfield Green Line South Station. Next. I'm going to give a little bit of background on the project, of our timeline, as well as a historic timeline that we have been pulling together. Talk about some of our online deliverables, including the story map and our engagement site, and then some of the next steps that we are moving into. Next. So Washington Park is what I would call an over-planned community. And we kept hearing from a number of stakeholders that we talked to. We are tired of having this planning process, the visioning. We don't need another plan. We need to see some action. So we want this project to be a different approach and not the typical CMAP visioning plan development. Our task is to update the one that I have highlighted in the middle, which is Elevated Chicago's work plan for the Green Line South. And we are focusing on the Garfield Station, or 55th, and we really want to look at what are the steps. Well, I guess the interesting part of this project is they really focused on actions that they know that they could make progress on. And so not having as broad of a vision, but we do want to look back to all of these past plans and see what are the recommendations that are still relevant and what are the reasons that things either did or did not advance, and if there are action steps that we could take to help move certain things forward. Next. Like I said, our focus is on the half mile around the Garfield Station, and most of that falls within the neighborhood or the community area of Washington Park, which is shown here in purple. And then the park, of course, to the right of that is in the study area as well. Next. One of the reasons that the Elevated Chicago team chose the Garfield Station and of the Green Line South as the focus area is because there are many vacant properties. I said there are 37 acres of vacant land, and a lot of that is city owned. So there is the potential to really have an influence on what that development is and make sure that it is done in a way that is benefiting the community that lives there and does not lead to the displacement of residents that are living there. Thank you. Our timeline initially was kind of thrown out the window because we were supposed to launch most of our engagement right when COVID hit. And so we weren't able to do the in-person work that we typically would want to do with a project of this nature. I have on here a couple of logos. We've got the Elevated Chicago logo and the RTA, because we have been partnering with RTA on this project from the beginning, and they have been helping us out quite a bit. And Elevated is the group that requested the project. We ended up transitioning to do a really deep dive into history, going through old Chicago Defender articles, reading books about Chicago history, and to create an in-depth analysis of policies and programs over the years that have impacted the community. And now our focus is on getting that resident input. We didn't feel like we had the relationships and the trust to just shift into online engagement for this community. So we are building up a resident advisory council or action council, and we will be pulling that together soon so that we can work on developing our action plan. Next. So I mentioned we were doing a historic timeline. This is what you see on the screen, and I can share the file. I'm not sure that we have it on our website yet, but we're still getting input on this. And we took a cue from the United for a Fair Economy approach to sharing history and assessing it as whether it is a boost or a block. And the blocks shown in pink, boosts in a light green. And these are things that either helped or harmed the community. And we can see that we started to have more of those blocks in the 40s. We have the homeowners loan corporation maps and blighted areas approach, and then slide to the next half of the timeline. And this is showing the that line in the middle is the population of the area. And so as the population peaked was when all these negative policies were coming into play. And from there, the community population generally was declining, except for the boost of population from the Robert Taylor Homes construction, which was quite popular at the time. But of course, the disinvestment in being able to maintain it well really led to its deterioration. And we saw that a lot of people left the community, moved away, those that could left. So we've seen a steady decline in population. But in recent decades, even, we've seen a stabilization of the population and more investment in the community. Next. I think I even heard Matt talking about it. CMAP uses the term disinvestment a lot. And I just kind of wanted to throw out what disinvestment looks like when we're talking about infrastructure. At its peak, the Green Line South, which is one of the oldest branches or lines, had 5 branches and 47 stations. It currently has only 2 branches and 12 stations. And the distance between stations has some spacing that you would not see on the north side of how far it is between them. And another example, when it was necessary to make important repairs on the line rather than working in off hours, the entire line was shut down for 2 years. And this is something that people were relying on to get to jobs every day, and a major inconvenience. And I think even that led to people moving out because it's just something that affects your life. Next. And then when it comes to the roadways in the area, because of the major barriers that surround this community, from the Dan Ryan Expressway, the park on the east, there are the highway and freight lines also on the south area. They make it so that the roads don't allow for through travel. So of the 16 east-west streets from 49th to 63rd, only 3 of them have east-west travel in both directions. And when you have that breaking up of the network, that funnels all the traffic onto those roads and leads to sort of more dangerous conditions, more uninhabitable, or not uninhabitable, but it is hard to have your commercial thriving development on the street when there's just such heavy traffic on those roadways. And then in the north-south direction, you have a lot of low traffic, multi-lane one-way streets that really is encouraging of speeding and can also lead to some dangerous conditions. Next. We also want to make sure that our project focuses on all the wonderful assets that there are in the community, and following up on the work of the Chicago Youth Map Corps group of identifying some of the assets in the area, from community institutions to businesses and financial institutions and joy centers. So we want to make sure that we recognize all the groups that are already doing the work in the community and have built wonderful assets there. So next, we will highlight that. Our, what I would call our existing conditions report has been made into an interactive online format right now in using story maps. So you can click on these images to learn more about each of these topics, and it has, like I said, an interactive format to it. And we've got some great photographs from Sandra Steinbrecher, as well as members of the Washington Park Camera Club. And I think the visual nature of it has been really well received. Next. We also created a number of videos of the community tour that Gian Foreman took us on, and it was kind of meant to be an internal thing so that other team members could experience it virtually. And Gian is just such a great tour guide that we wanted to make the videos public, so they are on our website. Next. We also have our engagement site that we're going to start pushing out and publicizing more now, and you can do next, and it'll just show you the bottom half of the screen. We'll have a survey and a link to the other interactive website, and then this ideas next. Oh wait, sorry, this is the right one. No, I misordered my slides. So I mentioned we are developing the Resident Action Council. So we have been putting up some flyers and we're reaching out to community groups to help publicize what will be kind of our advisory council, and we will be compensating residents for their participation. And that is an important aspect that we have from the beginning said we wanted to commit to. It's hard for CMAP to legally do that, but through our partnerships, we have been able to find a way that we will be able to compensate people. So we are happy about that. Next. This is the ideas page I thought I was linking to. Next, it'll show the bottom half where we have some of the past recommendations that we will be seeking input on. Next. So as I mentioned, we are in our engagement push, which we will hope to be doing more in person. There's going to be an upcoming community day where a mural is being painted and we'll be out there talking to folks. That date has not been set yet, but it should be this month. And we will be forming the resident advisory group. I think we've gotten about a dozen people submitting their interest, and we look forward to bringing that together. And the RTA is going to be releasing an RFP for an inclusive asset-based economic assessment. So a little bit of a different approach to our traditional market assessment, where there's a lot of, the surplus and leakage, but really a focus on how we can build upon the assets that are already there. And so we are currently going through the past recommendations and looking to have something to bring to the advisory council once we get started so that we can get to work on developing the action plan. Next, and that's really all that I have for you. I just wanted to show this picture of a really great new building in the community, which is affordable artist housing that I guess was opened in the last year or two. I bet Angela might know better than me, but it's a pretty neat building on the street. And I will share a link to some of our other links to other resources and open it up if anyone has any questions. But thank you for having me.
Thanks, Lindsay. So that was very informative and you flew through. So we have a little extra time for conversation should we need it. I just want to ask a quick question from the chair, I guess, and then I'll go hands I see in the audience. Again, I think this is a really tremendous opportunity in this neighborhood. I've been in this neighborhood a lot for different events the last few years, and it feels like a really special place to me because of the history and a lot of what you mentioned in your presentation. But I wondered, in moving forward into the action plan with community input, is there going to be an opportunity for older adults in the community to talk about their needs around whether it's aging in place, multi-generational housing, what amenities they need in order to feel secure and able to stay in the community? Are those conversations happening or will be happening?
So yes, I think the LISC quality of life plan highlighted the importance of providing a safe community for aging in place. And we do have a senior living center in the area. So we will be putting up flyers there and hoping to get at least one committee member on the council that could really speak to the needs of older adults. But that's a great point. Thank you.
Thank you. Angela.
Hey, Lindsay. Anyway, I just had a question. Thanks, this looks great. And as some of you may or may not know, I actually live in Washington Park, so I've met Lindsay on a couple of these. So this is actually awesome. But I'm just kind of curious. I know for me personally, I live 4 blocks from the Garfield Green Line and I don't walk. So like more for safety purposes and just access, like to your point about the north-south going streets, like there's not really, my street doesn't go straight through. I have to go through random alleys. So I don't know how much of this is taken into perspective for what you guys are talking about, but will there be recommendations about that? Because I'm imagining it's not, I mean, I'm privileged in that I have a car so I can drive to the train, but I'm guessing that's not what we're promoting either.
So when you say recommendations about this, do you mean about the street connectivity?
Or even the safety issues, like is that taken in consideration, like utilization and safety for, I imagine, most of my neighbors, probably more prominent as to why we go there regardless of any design. I just literally don't feel comfortable walking.
Yeah, we've heard a range of different opinions on the safety. We have talked to some people that walk every day and younger women, and they feel safe, but then there are others who have said they do not feel safe and they won't walk. And so we are not saying everybody should be walking, but making sure that it is going to be easy to get around. And I know we have met, well, I guess contacted CDOT. So we're looking to talk to their engineers to understand what is in their capital program and where they would want to make improvements. But safety is definitely, it's one of our chapters in the existing conditions report. And so it's something that we are taking into consideration and looking at the residents to give us more guidance on. Probably a weak answer to what you're saying, but yes, it is important.
Thanks, Angela. Susan?
Yeah. Hi, Lindsay. I probably worked on half of those plans that you showed on your first page, but safety, as Angela mentioned, is really key there. But I think also related to that, it would be useful for you all to look into the land ownership of not just the vacant parcels, but many of the apartment buildings, particularly south of 55th Street. Because there are a lot of institutional landowners. They've been sitting on them. Some of them have been vacant, and until you change that dynamic, because that land does have the potential to have population back in the neighborhood. But until you change the dynamic of the ownership of those residential buildings, that's not going to happen. And no matter what kind of plan you come up with, which is why there have been so many plans there. So I would urge you to look at that and come up with some recommendations for how that can begin to evolve and change. And also I would recommend that you reach out to CIC, Stacy Young or Jack Markowski. Jack before he was at CIC, used to be the Commissioner of Housing for the City of Chicago and was looking into a lot of those courtyard buildings. CIC happens to represent many property owners and naturally occurring affordable housing, particularly, which this neighborhood has some significant inventory. So I would, encourage you to look at those features as well as your recommendations, because the promoting of, development around that station will really hinge on the success of changing that dynamic. And then lastly, the University of Chicago bought up a bunch of property, as you probably already know, from Dan Ryan to King Drive, roughly, not Eon's building, but the other properties, particularly, I think they even got the gas station eventually. So, reaching out to them through either Theaster or Derek at the U of C to figure out, what their intentions are now that the library has located to Jackson Park instead of Washington Park. So the Obama Presidential Center, excuse me.
Well, thank you so much. Those are all very excellent points. We are meeting regularly with the Green Line South Community Table, and Arts and Public Life is part of that group. So the presence of the University of Chicago is definitely something that we are aware of and trying to work more with the university to understand what they're thinking of it, because we don't want them to be another of the absentee landowners that don't do anything with the property.
Right. Very good. Thanks.
And also we had a policy person on our team, and I'd really like to bring another policy back on. I'm looking at Matt right now. He might be in our sites, but really to understand what are some of the policies that are affecting the ownership with the properties as you're talking about. So I appreciate those comments.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Those are all really, really good comments. We go ahead and wrap this up, but thank you, Lindsay, for the presentation. And I have a closing question, but I'll hold off. I'll just talk to you offline so we can move on. All right. Well, thank you again for that conversation, everyone. And we'll go ahead and move on so we can wrap up on time or to it here. We're going to go ahead and go to member updates. From committee member update status reports. We have a couple of members who would like to share with us today. So I'll start with Caitlin.
Hi, so Matt asked me to just kind of give a quick overview of what's happening in the office market, which is what I generally focus on, and where things are post-COVID. So at the beginning of COVID, I think I told you guys how there was a lot of talk of what the effect is going to be on the suburbs, and that seemed to be what you guys were most interested in. So, we've definitely seen residentially people moving to the suburbs a lot more, but so far it has not at all affected the office market. We have not seen increased leasing in the office market in the suburbs, but we also haven't seen much leasing at all. So, and some of that, it's mainly because everything was on hold and things are opening up and there's a little bit more leasing activity, but we're still nowhere close to normal times. So in the downtown area, the CBD, leasing went from it's about a third less than it normally is. And in the suburbs, it's about half of what it normally is, but it's normally a lot less than the CBD. So it kind of evens out. But so we haven't seen any kind of exodus. We also aren't hearing about any kind of exodus. From talking to brokers, there are not really city businesses looking to move to the suburbs yet. So, but I am thinking that if that happens, it might be a year or two down the road once people kind of figure out, oh, all of our employees are now in the suburbs. And also as the millennials start to become more of the decision makers, if they are indeed moving to the suburbs, then we might start to see that. But so I would expect it to be, if it happens, a very slow process. The other things we are seeing is in the suburbs now, there's, so the first thing that happened, the first sort of sign of market trouble in the office market was an explosion in the sublease market, which really just happened downtown and not in the suburbs, but now it is happening in the suburbs as well. And then the most important thing though is people starting to actually use office again and come downtown. So downtown, I know that actual office usage is like 15% of normal, which is really kind of dangerous for the downtown area. Lots of retail has shut down. A lot of it is temporarily shut down, and no one wants to open until there's a reliable, source of people coming to the office every day. So there's a big push to get people to come to the office more. Now in the suburbs, I hear that office utilization is closer to 50%. So it seems that a lot of the hesitancy to come back to the office, obviously there's many reasons for that, but one may be transportation. So that's something that everybody's, looking at and trying to really convince people that public transportation is safe and they can use it and come downtown, come back to the office. But I don't think that there really will be a true return to the office until after Labor Day, when hopefully all of our kids are in school again full-time and things can really start to feel normal. And so until then, we really won't know what the future is going to hold, because everybody is just kind of waiting to see, do people want to come back to the office? This whole hybrid, working from home, working from the office thing, how is it all going to work out? It's like all anyone talks about, but there are no answers. We really won't know until we see what people want to do when COVID is not the biggest factor, when there's not that fear factor. So we really won't know until the fall, and then it'll be really interesting to kind of see what is happening. But there is much less talk. In the beginning, there was a lot of companies just saying, okay, we're just going to go all remote forever and shut down our offices. And people have definitely backed off of that. And there's a lot more talk of like bringing people back to the office, how we're going to do it and what that's going to look like. But no real answers yet. So does anyone have any questions for me? That's all I got.
All right. Thank you, Caitlin. Appreciate that. And just as a reminder to our members, this is a standing item on our agenda where sometimes people will be asked, like Caitlin was, to provide specific updates, or it's just a time for any of you who have stuff that you'd like to share to do so about potential collaborations or projects you're working on. These quick hit things, right? So things that can be described in just a few minutes. If you have things that you'd like to share at the next meeting for this item agenda, for the August meeting, please feel free to reach out to Dominic or Matt. We can get you on the agenda for the next time. And then our final member presentation is from Drew. Awesome. Are you here, Drew?
Yep. Hi, how's it going, Adam? Super brief. One of the things we were asked about, and I agreed to mention it, and we can unpack it more at a future meeting, but even before the pandemic, we were looking at how kind of conventional suburban retail shopping centers or other properties in districts that were zoned as commercial exclusive we're going to evolve and all the different dynamics that were going on. So we looked at one particular shopping center and adjacent properties and actually took some zoning action prior to the pandemic, which it seems reinforced was a good decision. There's a lot of interest in the property, and it introduced that housing and mixed use could be a part of what's otherwise kind of a traditional suburban shopping center. And then we're doing a sub area plan, which is not yet complete, but a much bigger area, far more parcels, pretty expansive part of that part of town. Looking at the same thing right now, zoning wouldn't allow housing, although you can have a range of uses. It's not really a traditional mixed use. All the built form things, bulk, height, density, that type of stuff. That center served a purpose, lasted generation, but what does it become going forward? How does it serve the community better going forward? Kind of all these things under like a retrofitting suburbia type of umbrella. And so, we're halfway through that process, but definitely the feedback we've heard from stakeholders, meeting with the shopping center owners themselves, the commercial property owners themselves, who are educating themselves on housing and meeting with housing developers and learning how these partnerships would work where they've never worked with folks that build housing before, because that's not what they do. They build retail centers or they build commercial office. So how do you even put those projects together? They're interested, or meeting with our local folks, the residents, the outreach and the stakeholders we've heard. Everybody seems to have an interest in it conceptually. So then it becomes devil in the details of, well, what would that look like and how do you zone that and what would that redevelopment or that process look like? So it's encouraging as the plan goes forward. If that's the recommendation, if those are the goals, then we'll jump to zoning reform as well to capture that. And then we'd have two parts of our US 41 corridor that would have new zoning to allow for housing and allow for different types of development that we've never had in those parts of town before. And we've seen that in some of our neighboring communities as well. So we think that's a big policy area for communities like ours. And the pandemic's just made it even more timely, is everybody's feedback. Although we had started before that, it seems like the timing happened to be good. So there's a lot to unpack and drop down menu from there, but that's definitely one of the bigger public policy making initiatives we have going now, is looking at these conventional suburban districts and what could they be going forward. And that's it.
All right, thanks, Drew. Moving on to other business. Dominic, Matt, anything you want to briefly mention here?
Just wanted to first thank you, Adam, for jumping in from vice chair to chair. I know you had a meeting where you actually had to MC it well, and you did it great. I really appreciate that. We had some items on other business. One about as we want to make our members' time effective here, we've sent out a survey. I know some members have answered it. We'll resend it. We look forward to your feedback. In the interest of time, we'll talk about it at another meeting, so there's another chance for you to answer that survey. And in an email, we will be sending out, probably talking about a video that CMAP's done about zoning that we think can be very informative. But thank you, members, for your time, and definitely thank you for being chair of this meeting and all the discussion of our members.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic and Matt, and thank you everyone for the great discussion today. Just a couple more items and we'll be on our way. Dominic, was there any public comment received in advance of the meeting?
No, there was not.
Is there anyone on the call who would like to make a public comment? Okay, hearing none, I'll go ahead and move to adjourn. Could I get a motion for adjournment, please?
I
So
motion.
moved. Christy Noble, so moved.
Thank you, Christy. Do I have a second?
I'll second that, Caitlin Ritter.
All right, thank you, Caitlin, with the second, and we are done right on time. All right, thank you, everyone. A reminder, our next meeting is coming up in August 3rd. So yeah, be on the lookout for updates and business ahead of that meeting, but we'll look forward to seeing you all again then, and have a great summer in the meantime, everyone. Thank you.